What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on Homebrewed Christianity, we got Anna Foerst. She is a professor of computer science and has a PhD in theology as well. She's at St. Bonaventure University and has been a longtime pioneer in artificial intelligence. Right after she finished her PhD, she worked on a postdoctoral fellowship at MIT in artificial intelligence and social robots. And that was one of the first places that kind of research was advanced. And it was there in that kind of context that she started to ask questions about what it means to be human. What are human and machines relationship? Does artificial intelligence change or transform it? And this is the kind of thing she raised in her book, God in the Machine, What Robots Teach Us About Humanity and God. And that is a part of this conversation, along with just some amazing reflection on the nature of artificial intelligence, different kinds, what challenges it raises for us as a species, what kind of understanding we might gain, what are the different research questions at work in the sciences, and what's really going on behind the kind of technological experience of AI, and what are the ethical challenges and questions that we should be wrestling with, and which ones are a bit apocalyptically exaggerated. It was a complete honor and treat to talk to a pioneer in this field. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you realize this is just one part of our artificial intelligence series. If you want to find out more about it, you can head over to processthis.substack.com. There'll be links to it on this post, because we're doing a series. I'm being joined by my friend Kester Bruin throughout the series, author of Godlike, his newest book that just has been exploring AI. And we're talking to philosophers, scientists, theologians, legislators, all trying to understand humanity's relationship to technology, artificial intelligence, place in it, and hopefully get an interdisciplinary look and the interdisciplinary richness that comes across by talking to people from different perspectives and fields to have a better understanding of what's going on, have more thoughtful reflection and challenges to raise in the public square. So come along for the journey. And if you want to join up, be a member of that and on the Substack, or get access to all 45 plus classes we've done as on Homebrewed Christianity, then go to homebrewedcommunity.com. There you'll be able to join to the Substack community if you want, or join up at theologyclass.com, which will also hook you up with a membership in the Substack. You'll support the podcast, get to interact more, get that ad-free podcast feed, and more. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy it. And honestly, this is one of the most fun conversations I've had. And I was so pumped because I'd been reading her. I'd found all these different lectures that she gave and read through the articles. And it was one of the most helpful thinkers to think with prior to this conversation. So hopefully my excitement and preparation doesn't distract from just how powerful her own work has been since really being a pioneer in it. So anyway, hope you enjoy it. If you want to hang out in person, you can come to Theology Beer Camp this October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. 30 plus God pods, 30 plus scholars, over 500 other people. Come on. You can come. theologybeer.camp. Good times with friends. Smoochy boochies. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today, a part of our podcast series on AI, Anne is here, and not only do we have someone who's wrestled with it on the scientific side, but also theologically, and has been raising questions in this area for a long time. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about your work is the questions around AI, religion, and such were a part of your interest before everyone, their mom, and their cousin were into it. So I'd love for us to get to know a bit about your own story at where these different disciplines started to intersect, and you began wrestling intellectually with questions that are just now kind of coming front of mind in the public square.
It was actually right after college. When I was going for my master's in theology, I had my I studied computer science just to get free computer courses. I wasn't, because in Germany, university is free. So I signed up for computer science, came across AI, and thought that is interesting. So I wrote my dissertation actually about possibilities for a non judgmental dialogue between artificial intelligence and theology. My idea was that artificial intelligence is a kind of religion, with believers and with a very clear anthropology, a very clear understanding of what it means to be human. And I wanted to see how that actually gets together with theological understandings of what it means to be human. And while I was doing that work, I based my dissertation on the theology of Paul Tillich and went regularly to Harvard to the Tillich archives. And while I was there, I went to MIT, it's right across the street, the other end of town, and learned about AI. And basically, both schools invited me after my dissertation to come as a postdoc.
Oh, that's exciting. And when you think about the kind of emergence of AI in the public square, oftentimes how we define artificial intelligence can help us get a better idea of what kind of questions we need to be asking and which ones maybe are getting asked again, but have always been a part of humanity's relationship with technology. So how do you try to describe or frame artificial intelligence?
Well, it's usually defined as that part of computer science that makes machines that perform tasks for which we usually think intelligence is necessary. That's a very broad definition. And within this artificial intelligence, there are two camps. One is the camp that is dominant right now with ChatGPT and other large language models, which are shortened as LLMs. That is the idea that we can rebuild brains, right? That we can rebuild cognition in a brain. The camp I belong to is called Embodied AI. And that's the idea that in order to build truly intelligent machines, we need to build bodies, that the body is the key for intelligence. And so when you come from that embodied approach to artificial intelligence, you basically believe that LLMs, as fascinating as they are, will never truly achieve human intelligence.
In that kind of commitment to not thinking essentially big data where it's being processed at large in large amounts can't generate the kind of intelligence that I think people are asking about. A lot of that is grounded in kind of a thicker account of human anthropology. Is that right?
Right.
One of the difficulties I think in differentiating the two is humanity, regardless of what we're attending to, huge powers to anthropomorphize. Whether
Right.
it's whether it's something I'm not going to say because a listener might not have headphones on and their a box in their room might start talking to them or their phone might wake up. But how do you kind of address first that innate desire within the human to anthropomorphize to then get a better idea of what's on the other side?
Well, I mean, of course, the classical movie about that is Her, which I love, and that's actually, yes, I won't speak the name either, but that was kind of a movie about those voice animated assistants. I don't think it is necessary to avoid anthropomorphization because we do it all the time. I mean, we do it with God, right? Like God the shepherd, God the judge, God has us on her breast, right? I mean, there are so many metaphors in the Bible that we use to anthropomorphize God. And I think it's the natural reaction that we have towards everything that interacts with us, right? I anthropomorphize my cat. Actually, I sometimes anthropomorphize my car. And so I think this constant saying, "Oh, we shouldn't anthropomorphize," is not the right way to approach it. I think it's much rather anthropomorphize as much as you want, but be aware that even though you anthropomorphize, it is not human.
I think the more we know about the kind of naturally maturational cognitive mechanisms that humans develop early on, the more we realize how we're constructed to kind of be seduced in a sense to
Right.
anthropomorphizing things in the world.
Well, I mean, as babies, everything we interact with is human. And that comes most natural to us. So in fact, it's the easiest thing to treat everything as if it was human, because that's what we're good at, right? So I think it's perfectly fine. Just keep in mind that this, just as an example, I tried to make my voice thing that I don't want to wake up right now. I wanted to play music was my first love, and music is my last. You know that song, right? And it doesn't get it because it ignores the term music and just is my first love. That's what it's looking for. And then it plays me some crazy songs. So they are really, really, really stupid. And ChatGPT, even though it's way smarter, it's still very stupid. It had me as a dead Catholic nun. I'm neither dead, nor am I a nun, nor am I Catholic. But for years, I mean, since it came out, it had me as a dead Catholic nun. It learned by now. It knows now that I'm alive. But that was kind of disconcerting, you know.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're not dead. That would
Yeah,
that
so
would be
am
a whole
I.
other series of ethical questions about this conversation. In your work, you've spent some time contrasting what is a human and what is a person, so that we can kind of take more seriously the challenge that could be on the horizon when it goes to social intelligence or social artificial intelligence. Can you kind of tell that story, or like making that distinction with both your maybe your Lutheran Tillichian hat on, and then as a scientist working on it?
So there are two ideas that came to my understanding of personhood. One is the anthropomorphization, right? That we are willing to treat everything or most things as if they're human. There are all these experiments about how humans project human-like qualities into computers, right? I mentioned my car and my cat, right? We do it with animals, we do it with our pets. So on the one end, there's this willingness to treat non-human entities as human. And on the other hand, there is this absolute capability and horrible capability to deny humans personhood. Every genocide, every racist slur, every gender-based rejection is based on that we deny someone personhood based on superficial qualities that we think disqualify them from being human, being a person. And so I realized that even though we tend to use person and human interchangeably, they are actually not the same. And so I was kind of wondering what then makes humans persons. So I want to apply personal to all human beings, right? That's kind of what my Bible tells me, right? When God creates humans in God's image, God creates every human being as a divine statue. And then the Bible actually is very clear about male and female, right? So, in other words, it doesn't matter how you look, it doesn't matter what gender you are, it doesn't matter what you are. As soon as you are a human being, you are a divine statue and worthy of admiration. And that is a very powerful statement, but we humans are incapable of following that, right? So then I have to ask myself, what then constitutes personhood? And one thing that I realized is that we cannot use any empirical criteria. So, for instance, when I asked the question of could robots be persons, people would say, but robots doesn't have a sense of smell. Well, we can develop that, right? But robots cannot have not achieved human-like intelligence. Well, we can develop that, right? And it went on and on and on and on. And they were always using empirical criteria that will ultimately also exclude humans from the community of persons. And so basically what we have to say is that human personhood is an assignment by God. That's the theology hat, right? And an assignment by society. But society has to be aware that their assignment of personhood is flawed. So that's, in a nutshell, the concept of personhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned a couple different places when you were working across religious traditions around this, when you discovered the larger Jewish conversation around the Golem coming out of Psalm 92. and then the way it gets explored in the Kabbalist tradition.
132.
Yeah, 132. And, one of the things that you mentioned it, and that led me to tracking things down and realizing, wow, there's that's in our sacred text, and I had no idea, about it, let alone that it was there's like a history of a tradition wrestling with a question that as Christians, we didn't even know we needed to ask yet.
Right.
So I'd love for you to take some time to kind of unpack that and what it was like for you to learn it, and then as someone who spends a lot of time wrestling on the more scientific and technical side, what it was like to bring together this gift from a wisdom tradition that wasn't your own to an intellectual question that's taking place in your research projects.
Well, it was actually that while I was at MIT as a postdoc and then later as a researcher, that someone told me the story that when the first big mainframe computer in Israel was named Golem. Okay. And they basically said, see, we are from the Golem tradition. And then I learned that a lot of researchers at MIT who were Jewish and who were the founders of artificial intelligence in the 60s and 70s came from the Golem tradition. And that Golem tradition goes as follows. So in the 15th century, Yehuda Loew, the Maharal of the Prague ghetto, is supposed to have built a golem, a statue made from clay. And then he put the name Yahweh on its forehead. Yahweh is truth. On the forehead of the golem, and he would erase these letters, and then the golem went to sleep at night, but he would write them on, and then the golem came to life. So the symbolism here is that only God makes things alive. And this golem is supposed to have rescued the Jews from a whole bunch of pogroms, like, for instance, and that's actually a historical fact, Christians would hide dead babies in the ghetto to come the next day to accuse Jews of killing babies in their rituals, and then have an excuse for a pogrom, killing a lot of Jews. And the golem is supposed to have hidden those babies and stuff like that. So the golem is supposed to have helped, but the golem also is supposed to have erased the aleph of the word emet, which is truth in Hebrew. And when you erase the aleph, you are left with the term mot, which means dead. So in other words, the golem then erased the aleph and was left with the statement, God is dead. And so the people were, of course, aghast and said, oh my God, what is going on? And the golem basically said, if you admire now me, and you will stop admiring God when you are able to create something that is human-like. And therefore, God is dead. So that is one branch of the very interesting story. The other branch is that one day the golem went berserk. So it was given a command and no one could start it. The Maharal had left and no one knew how to stop the golem. And the Maharal came back and buried the golem in the attic of the synagogue in Prague. And there it is supposed to lie until it will come back on the final day to help the Jews. So, and out of this, and that the Maharal invented a secret term that would bring the golem to life when it was needed. And it was a very secret term that only very few people know. And so when these AI researchers in the 60s compared notes, they actually realized that they all have been told the secret term that brings the golem back to life. So they all knew it. And I still don't know it. I've been asking, can I know? No, they wouldn't tell me that. So there's a very strong tradition of building artificial humans that has influenced the Jewish idea, the Jewish researchers that started artificial intelligence. And I think it is fascinating because in Christianity we only know as Golem, you have made me, right, which is in Psalm 139, and it's usually translated as unknown form or embryo or something like that. And then the Kabbalah in the 15th century took over the term, and the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, and created this figure out of it. So it's a fascinating, I wouldn't even say it's a coincidence. It's a fascinating storyline that goes from 15th century Prague all the way to MIT in the 60s, where artificial intelligence was founded.
Oh, yeah. And that also sounds like a great a great narrative for a really cool documentary, right? Where
That would be cool. Yes.
yeah, and it it's trying to discover the secret word, but it's telling how human beings have had this deep history of wrestling both with what does it mean to be born in a world where you're told symbolically you're made in the image of God, and to wrestle with the creation of another. And as someone who's both Lutheran and Talikian and that kind of framing, I mean he's kind of notorious when it goes to his anthropology, both in the sense of taking seriously the way we're a part of the larger evolutionary story and such, and then taking the text really seriously in Genesis, the ones before Abraham, to look at the human predicament in an intense way. Every time I end up getting to teach him to students, the more conservative ones get really worked up when it gets to his interpretation of the fall. But I noticed in
I
your work,
love that.
you actually look at the way with the way infants develop language and facial recognition and such in the first year of life, as a place where where these cognitive mechanisms that will develop for most of us naturally come online, where this kind of differentiation in the world is the place that personhood comes to be established, and that principle of differentiation generates the angst at the heart of the human. So I saw it show up in a number of places, reading and watching lectures online, and would just love to hear you spend some time with Tillich and how the cognitive development helped open up that question around personhood.
So it's actually quite interesting. Tillich thinks that in paradise we are not fully human. Because when you think about it, children develop self awareness between 36 and 40 months of age. Before that, they don't have self awareness. So that is actually quite interesting. And when you think about the act of self awareness, it means the first act is that I distinguish between I and you, right? That I now can be alone, all versus one, right? That I now have an I, you, or I, thou, or I object relationship. And when I am in that thing, then I start judging and trying to understand the world. I try to develop categories where I can put things in. And that leads, on the one hand, to estrangement. That's back to Tillich, right? Because I can say, you are black, right? You are not like me. Or you are female or male, you are not like me. Or you are rich, you are not like me. You are poor, you are not like me, right? So it leads us to judgment of other human beings, and therefore leads to estrangement. At the same time, though, it also meets, and Tillich never spells that out, but I think it is deeply rooted in his theology. It also enables us to judge what is beautiful, for instance. So we humans are the only art creating beings, right? Because we judge our central input. My cat doesn't care if the admirer of her is black, white, or spotted, or calico, or whatnot, right? But we judge, to stay with that example, cats by how beautiful they are, right? And we judge everything about it based on beauty, and we reject the non beautiful, and therefore we create art because we go out of our way to create positive sensual input. So, in other words, the fall doesn't make us only into estranged human beings that create boundaries between humans, it also turns us into artists. So basically, with eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, with starting to judge between what is good and what is evil, we actually become fully human, the self-aware, fully humans that we are. And basically, when you look at the metaphors that I used in the first creation account, the one of the 7 days, right, which is distinct from the one between Adam and Eve. But the first creation account, God creates heaven and earth, God creates land and sea, God creates other humans, light and darkness, right? And God says, and it was good. So God does not judge between good and evil, but we human beings do. That makes us humans, that make us estranged. And to go a step further, the whole idea of God becoming human, right? The incarnation, the key belief in Christian faith to which we both belong, is of course the idea that God has to experience estrangement in order to understand the human condition.
One of the places, and I didn't have to remember this. I don't remember where it is. I think it's in volume 3 of the Systematic, where he talks about, part of the structure of being human is to be addressed. Where
Right.
well, when we develop that subject-object distinction that you're talking about in early childhood, and I think part of what you're getting at there is right that when you get that gap, which in one sense generates estrangement, the other thing it can generate is recognition. That
Right.
in the advent of difference and the subject's experience of the world, you get the gift of recognition, and that's where aesthetics or beauty come in, which is where so much of his ethical work comes from. Is the recognition of that difference, not absolutizing or quantifying the other's subjectivity away. Uh,
Right.
and that makes to me a real fruitful place when you start to think about questions of artificial intelligence, because we anthropomorphize and all this kind of thing, it's easy to start projecting it on places. But when we think of the questions around social artificial intelligence and what it is we're creating, how does that the developmental process of being human, how does the importance of a body and in being embodied in things help us understand just what all's entailed in genuine subjectivity?
Well, when we look at the Bible, it is clear that the body is key, right? I mean, if there is a resurrection, it is embodied, right? The incarnation, Jesus became flesh. Then there are all these Bible translations where you have heart and mind. It's usually heart and kidney, so there are a lot of physical metaphors, the kidney as a sign of emotions, the heart as the seat of reason. They didn't know the function of the brain then, right? The liver, the uterus actually as a sign of empathy. So the Bible talks quite often about God's uterus. So the whole idea is that the body makes us the empathetic beings that we are, the people who can relate, the people who can overcome estrangement. And it is the body that is the tool for that. The body is also the tool for estrangement. That's a whole other thing, right? Because the skin at the same time connects us to the world, but skin also is the boundary between us and the rest of the world, right? So it's this bizarre, what Tillich would call ambiguity, right? It is with the body that we touch other human beings, and it's with the body that we connect. And there's tons of research that shows, for instance, that what we are right now doing is not truly connecting, even though we talk, because it's a two-dimensional space. Humans are truly only interacting when they're in a three-dimensional shared space. And there's lots of research about how limited the two-dimensional interactions are. But and that is one of the reasons why I think needs to be embodied, because otherwise we are never fully interacting with the AI when it's only via a keyboard and a monitor, right? I mean, AI has gotten better. The newest version of ChatGPT understands language, spoken language. So that's definitely a progress, but it's still not the same thing. It's still, there is no shared physical space.
And in thinking about that social form of intelligence and such, the things we're trying in technologically to reproduce, comes from like modeling so much of language of people that develop language precisely by being embodies. You, I know you like to joke about the putting butter on a piece of toast as a contrast point between outdoing any other chess player. But what's fascinating to me is just how that contrast itself reveals so much the volume of just intelligence and engaging and experiencing the world we rarely reflect on as a species as brilliant, but we're great at like isolating on a particular thing and seeing it done exceptionally.
Yeah, and that is kind of again the underlying understanding of human beings that we have in modern AI, the AI that everyone is talking about, right? It's basically the idea that our bodies are there to nurture the brain, and that it's really all about the brain and cognition, right? And that we can mimic that, and it neglects completely the embodiment of cognition, and it neglects that cognition is there to socially interact. The smartest animals in the kingdom, in the animal kingdom, are the ones that are social. Crows are insanely smart because they are so social, and dolphins and other primates. And so whatever, when as soon as an animal is very social, it is usually very smart. So we are very social, and that is why we are very smart. And the current AI tends to completely forget it. It's all about machine learning, it's all about raw data that is fed into the machine. And then there are the parameters by which the tokens of data are connected. And it's great technology. I love ChatGPT. I use it all the time, right? But we should never forget that it lacks the embodiment, and it therefore will never be like us. And I also think when we talk about that it will never be like us, it gives room to fret about the problems with ChatGPT because there are tons of them. There are the hallucinations, right? Which are but in the AI research, don't talk about hallucinations because it is anthropomorphizing that term. We talk about confabulations. So that's a huge problem. There's the problem of categories that they come up with, like race, class, gender, right? That on the one hand, it gives us a mirror when ChatGPT spews racist sayings, right? There was this recent experiment where they had people talk to ChatGPT either in an in African American language or in white American English. And then ChatGPT was told that they committed a crime, and it suggested jail terms for people with African American English 5 times as often as it did for white people. So it is racist, right? And there is no reason to argue it out of it because racism is rooted in our embodiment, right? And ChatGPT learned to be racist because of it feeds of what is online, and what is online is unfortunately not only good but a lot of really evil stuff, right? And so but ChatGPT is racist, but it doesn't really understand racism because it is not rooted in self-awareness and therefore the concept of otherness that we have.
One of the things that I wonder from the tech side, what role does the sheer volume of human language being brought into an algorithm, or all the markers of surveillance around our attention and such being brought in, how do you think about how that brings in the uh, I don't know, the parts of our own embodied existence that generate that kind of language or generate that kind of attention, that it knows adolescent boys want to see pictures of extremely attractive women on a regular basis to get their attention. Right, it in many ways is adapting to something that's biological. It just like our prejudice in language and these kinds of things. But when an algorithm does not have the embodied experience with it, what role do you see those playing?
Well, I would say that ChatGPT doesn't gain that knowledge based in embodied experience. It gets this experience based on its observation of the
Hmm.
web. So there is no real language understanding there. It's ultimately sees language words as tokens, translates them into numbers, and uses statistical models to see what words goes with what and what image goes with what, right? It has become now image. So when it shows pretty women or voluptuous women, I should better say, right, to adolescent boys, it's not that it understands the nature of adolescent boys. It's that it statistically realizes that there is a connection between adolescent boys and those images. And it sees that enough online to draw that conclusion that that is what adolescent boys want to see. But it completely lacks the understanding of what happens in adolescence.
So when our relationships get mediated digitally, and then what's being shown to us is getting there to hold our attention, and it's holding our attention so we can be marketed to. When we go to write, we're telling it what kind of things we want to write and what tone we want to have, and then it's doing predictive text. It seems to me that in both of those examples, decisions that in the past were a place that a human where they end up expressing themselves, right? Like in the generation of text, and then who you give attention to and what things you respond to. These added layers of mediation and anticipating our responsiveness towards a norm. In some ways, the technology is a way of inserting itself into our subjectivity in ways that it hasn't before.
That is correct. And I would even add something more. I mean, there's the art of the prompt, right? Where's lots of stuff. So what prompt gets you the best results with I'm using ChatGPT basically like you use Kleenex for all, ChatGPT as the example. I don't want to always say LLM, but so ChatGPT and others, I should say, but by um, so there's the art of the prompt. That you have to give a good prompt in order for ChatGPT to do its thing. So we learn to think in prompts. And that basically makes our language expression poorer because we learn to talk to an AI and we learn to talk to an AI in a way that the AI can understand us. And therefore, we reduce our speech patterns, we change our speech patterns. And I see that as a major problem.
Yeah, and those kind of limits, there are some of them that are biological for humans. When it goes, say, like Dunbar's number and like the limits of humans, that we have this kind of like deep personhood, even if we have an ethical obligation beyond that
Right.
limit. And I wonder if that the way the person seizes us, just the human, but like in that personal sense, how has that boundary been made porous in a sense by technology?
Well, I mean, the Dunbar number is, of course, the limit of 150 people or beings, I should say,
Yeah.
with whom we can bond at every given time. So there seems to be this limit. Some people are amazing in what they can totally surpass that, but usually that's the limit number. Most groups fall apart when they have more than 150 members because then we kind of tend to put people in categories rather than understanding them as a person. We humans are quite limited in that regard. We tend to underestimate that. So the nice thing about the Dunbar number is that ChatGPT and other LLMs only take one space of the 150. We don't see it as a lot of different things. So in that way, even if we treat an LLM as a human and it takes one spot of the 150 persons that we can have in life, that still leaves 149, so that still leaves a pretty high number. So in other words, here's the good news about anthropomorphizing. We treat it as one, as a single being. I still think it is problematic because when we interact with several LLMs, each one of them takes a spot, right? Claude takes a spot and ChatGPT takes a spot and all the others take a spot. And so our capability to interact with humans becomes reduced.
In that when you think of uh, the questions of personhood and the possibilities of that more social version of artificial intelligence. Where do you, how would you describe where we are now technologically and the challenges it faces in as a research program before the kind of ethical questions we ask get more significant?
As long as ChatGPT and other LLMs are not embodied, they don't raise the question of personhood. Because what there are huge large language models. They are not conscious. They are, even though they tell you differently, right? They are not conscious. They don't have a sense of self. They are not embodied, so they don't raise the question of personhood. They raise a whole slew of ethical questions, but not those. There are attempts to build LLMs into physical things. So, for instance, a lot of smart cars, smart vehicles have now LLMs built into them, but you still have the LLM as the controlling feature. You don't have the body giving a lot back, right? So it's not quite the embodiment that we humans experience. But there are attempts, and I think the better the bodies get for the LLMs, and when the LLMs really learn through sensory input, I think that's the moment where we have to ask the question of personhood.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that, in a sense, that desire for anthropomorphism and stuff will, in some way, we will have a relationship with a robot before the robot ever has a relationship with us?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we project into robots long before they truly have achieved intelligence. And then the other thing that I believe is that we cannot just plop an LLM into a robotic body. The robot might use LLM technology, so the deep learning, but it should still be distributed over the whole system, not just a brain that controls the body, because that's not how we built. And it still should develop. It should go through developmental stages with regard to recognizing us as human beings it can interact with as partners, so to say.
In a sense, it's a parallel version of the human's own developmental process that involving like the continuity of a self, right? Like when there's a local, when there's an embodied form of something, you're much more likely to have consistent developing relations with this person over time, and not think, oh well, the whatever's happening on the back end could have completely disappeared or changed in the past.
Yes. Are you familiar with Paro? Paro is this robot seal that is
Mm-hmm.
used especially in Alzheimer patients. Instead, they can have real pets, and so they get a Paro. And Paro reduces aggressivity, makes people with Alzheimer much more social, much clearer, helps them memorize stuff. And it has an incredible impact on people with Alzheimer, really makes them much more able, makes them happier. And so Paro is an embodied robot, right? It has this fuzzy fur, it snuggles, right? It snuggles with them, it reacts to positive input. When they stroke it, it reacts positively. When they hit it, it reacts negatively. So there is actually a lot of very interesting stuff going on. Why? Because it is embodied and shares the physical space.
Yeah, yeah, and how does that kind of the increasing complexity of AI that are especially those housed in robots change the way we think about our relationships with them ethically? Like, what are there ways that our responsibility towards our own creations in a technological space change at particular points in its development?
I don't think we are there yet. I don't think we are there yet where we have to really assign personhood to robots. Cog and Kismet, the two humanoid robots that are now in the MIT museum, but those were the robots I worked with. They didn't have a sense of self, but that shouldn't be a criterion because there are humans who don't have a sense of self, right? While I was willing to assign personhood to Kismet, I also knew it was not yet a person. I'm willing to assign personhood to my cat. And I would even go so far that when I had a choice between rescuing a stranger, a human being who was a stranger, and my cat, I probably would rescue my cat because I have a relationship with her, right? We don't have it in our brain to have an abstract concept of human beings are always valuable. We just don't have that. It's not part of our nature, but we are not yet there to assign robots personhood. As soon as they combine a deep learning system, an embodied deep learning system, as soon as they build an embodied deep learning system, I could imagine we will ask that question.
So, as someone much more involved in the on the research side, uh, what kind of questions should people be losing sleep over when it goes to artificial intelligence?
Oh, there are lots of different questions. I mean, there's for instance, I mean, we talked about a mind body split, so that a lot of humans don't recognize the importance of their own embodiment. The body is often seen as a tool, and LLMs reinforce that understanding of humans, which is a big problem. Another big problem is the bias. We talked already about that. LLMs give us the illusion of objectivity while they're in fact not objective. So that's a huge problem. Another problem is, of course, privacy. Not only is there no privacy in LLMs because everything is stored for improvement. And by the way, ChatGPT denies that. ChatGPT claims that it keeps your things private, but that's simply not true. And if you read the user manual, you realize that it's not true. But so there is no privacy. And at the same time, LLMs are used very thoroughly by, for instance, the NSA and the ICE to spy on us, which is, of course, a major problem. I mean, the spying on us is already all present, but LLMs have made it much easier, especially now with the facial recognition. There's the whole question of AI and labor. When AI is introduced into the labor, into the workspace, workers cannot opt out. Right? It's a forced engagement. They have to interact with AI if they want it or not, and that means they are forced to reskill, to learn skills completely new. And there's a power asymmetry between the people who introduce the AI and the people who are working. And by the way, the people who work on the LLMs are very low paid, even though they're experts, because they're interchangeable. And there are even studies that talk about the lasting psychological trauma. So these are just some of the ethical questions that we have to be aware of. I mean, there are plenty more, but those are some.
How does artificial intelligence and the kinds of questions you're raising shape the way, as a theologian, you wrestle with our relationship with technology? I mean, that's something we, as a tradition, and then as a species, we don't know ourselves without our relationship to technology, and technology's played a huge role in reshaping religion in its history, but it's often unexamined. And so
Right.
I wonder, as someone inspired by a theologian that took it very seriously, like Paul Tillich, and then being deeply invested in artificial intelligence, how's the relationship of humanity and technology an important theological question?
Well, we humans seem to be, I mean, there are other animals that shape the world to some extent, like beaver dams or, monkeys and primates using stones to crack nuts. I mean, there are tool building, technology building animals around. But the human animal seems to be the only one that really has technology where it can completely change the world. I mean, climate change is just an example of where we humans have actually, on a planetary scale, changed the world, right? And the interesting thing is that we usually see technology as a part of us, as an expression of who we are, while the theologian would always warn that techne is also something that can serve as a tool for estrangement. And I see that particularly with AI and social media, for instance. How many relationships, especially our adolescents, I see that with my students. I come into the classroom and the students are all on their phones instead of talking to one another, right? And that's not only my observation, that's a standard observation that we have. So, in other words, to a large extent, technology has replaced the 3D physical shared physical space relationship, and that is highly problematic because the online relationship can never replace the shared physical space, as I mentioned before. So I think that LLMs will only exacerbate the problem because they are smart, so that rather than interacting with humans via technology, that we are actually interacting with the technology. And that will create more estrangement because it means that we are less social. There are already studies that children age 5 and 6 who interact a lot with technology, who have smartphones and all that sort of stuff, that they have much less social skills than the kids who do not have the technologies. So we see already a atrophy of social skills in children. And I find that a very problematic development.
And I think one of the things that make the ethical challenges of technology and in the present, the way artificial intelligence is being utilized, one of the ways it becomes so difficult is the engine of culture and economics is one where to not opt in, to not utilize the technology and the tools is to voluntarily get left behind in so many places of our life. And when it goes to even kids and teenagers and such, to not be involved in social media, as a dad who didn't let his teenager get the social apps until he turned 16, I was keeping him away from having real friends and these other kinds of things because of the collective action problem at a relational level and the collective demand of the market. The theological and ethical predicament around technology seems extremely overwhelming, or like the temptation to say no is extremely hard. Like, how do you negotiate that tension?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's not possible for us to become Luddites, right? We can't. And so I think the way out of that is to teach a responsible use of LLMs. For instance, in my classroom, the students in my CS 101 Computer Science 101 course, they have to write every week what I call a current event, where they have to find an article from the last 2 weeks that deals with technology, and then they have to summarize it, criticize it, and then write 3 questions for the author they would like to get answered. And what I tell them is to have the article summarized by ChatGPT and then read it themselves and then modify the summary. So, in other words, they realize, I mean, sometimes they just take the ChatGPT summary and are done with it, right? But very often they realize that ChatGPT did not a good job in summarizing it, that something was missing. And so they modify it. So, what I'm teaching them here is to use LLMs where it's necessary, but to also critically reflect on ChatGPT and its shortcomings, right? So that is how we should do it. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people in academia still simply prohibit the use of ChatGPT, which is, in my opinion, completely ludicrous because students use it no matter what. So we might much rather better off by teaching them a responsible use of LLMs. And that I think we have to do as college professors because we send our kids out in the world where LLMs are used, right? So we much rather should teach them the responsible use. That is kind of my theological answer to that dilemma. So it's not possible to just prohibit the use. That's just delusional. But I think teaching a responsible use of those technologies is the way to go.
One of the kind of theological questions around personhood get problematized the most now and maybe in the horizon when you see the increasing steps of social artificial intelligence.
Well, I mean, first of all, it's that we friend people on social media, right? And therefore we claim to treat them as persons, even though we really can't, right? I mean, I love advice columns. That's my secret passion. And so often you have there the story of someone who fell in love with someone they interacted with online, right? Without realizing that that is just not possible, right? It just doesn't work that way. So there's that problem. But I also would say again, the question doesn't come up for ChatGPT and other current LLMs, but if we build them embodied, then we would have to ask the question: are those persons, and do they deserve rights? Right? And then comes the question: what happens if they surpass us in intelligence? How would that actually reflect on us? How would we deal with the fact that we've created something that is smarter than we are? Perhaps if they become embodied and we can explain to them what a problem racism is, for instance, or what a problem classism is, or sexism, or all the other isms that keep people estranged from one another, perhaps they actually might be able to overcome that sort of judgment, right? They still would judge, but they would at the same time question their own judgment constantly. I mean, they would be better humans than we are, right? Because they would be less estranged. I mean, that would be phenomenal. So in a way, one thing that I see in embodied LLMs, right, once they are embodied, that they could be the better humans, and therefore give us a mirror to look up to and to strive towards. Of course, that is my very optimistic take on it. What is much more realistic is that they build embodied LLMs that are really truly smart and abuse them to oppress people.
Well, the history of modern technologies getting utilized for war and violence
Exactly. And
is pretty
sex. Don't
impressive.
forget the
And
sex.
sex, yeah, the more baser power seeking instincts of the human being generate quite the creativity.
Right.
And do you think part of it, and this is something that you've emphasized in thinking about social robots, is yeah, there it may not be practical in some sense to extend things like social signals or certain kinds of senses, but when you think of that developmental aspect of a social robot, then things like shared attention or taking turns, vocal modulation, eye contact, the way we learn facial expressions and read body language, these kinds of things, that having them in some ways it generates the possible variables for more complex social and ethical relations.
So we would have to, no, we wouldn't have to build that in. The robots would have to learn those things, because a baby is not born with turn taking, right? It,
Right,
it
right, right.
learns it. And so I
It's
think we
learned
would have to,
as something for survival. Right. So
right.
right, it's not just that they learn it and it's something you upload. It's learned because it's selected for socially and culturally.
Yeah, and I think we would could build those senses in, right? We would have to build those. Um, uh, 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 the survival instinct is obviously not there in a robot, right? Because it's not biological being. So there are some things, some parameters we would have to build in. I mean, ChatGPT has 17 billion parameters. So ways it connects the data, which is unbelievable. So an embodied robot would have to have much more parameters. And some of those parameters could be the social intelligence and the social drives that an infant is born with and learns then to develop. It could be done
Mm-hmm.
if someone is willing to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wonder if the dream, I mean, if the current artificial intelligence is not the bandwagon on which all these tech companies have basically focused, and if there's really a will to have a truly human-like intelligent machine. Because again, if we had a truly human-like intelligent machine that was self-aware, we would raise the question of personhood. We would have to treat them not as slaves, but as persons, right? And I don't think that the tech companies want that. It might be the dream of academics, but we don't have the money.
Well, yeah. Well, and increasingly, the number of people tenured with the kind of context where you get to ask non-grantable questions is diminishing.
Right.
And even like the presence of the humanities in education. I think this is one of the areas that has shown up in talking to multiple scholars working in artificial intelligence is that the people in the frontiers of STEM research are the ones that tend to be most scared of an education system with a flattening out and a minimizing of the role of humanities, while the cheerleaders and fundraisers for the STEM fields are like, let's put more time and energy into
Yes.
this kind of research.
No, I'm glad that I'm teaching at a university that is profoundly committed to the liberal arts, where they take a lot of ethics courses, because I think that's necessary. We have to send our students out into the world with a good ethical understanding of the problems that are out there, with an ethical mindset. That's basically what we need. Again, with a critical reflection of the technologies, a critical use of the technologies that are out there, and an ethical mindset. I think if we develop our students in that direction, the world is not quite yet doomed.
One of the kind of intersections around AI technology and human beings that generates a widely diverse set of responses is whether or not artificial intelligence is a breakthrough point when it goes to evolution. Humans have had an evolving relationship with technology, from outsourcing part of our digestion to fire, to the emergence of symbolic language, and all the way on. And as Protestants, the printing press, not unrelated to the Reformation or the emergence of modern nation states. And when and in each of these kind of different arrangements of humans and the way we organize politically, economically, religiously, culturally, technology plays such a big role that there are a trajectory of futurist options when people imagine what happens with a kind of a global, the digital globe, shared consciousness type stuff, the emergence of genuine persons that we are the creators of, and that kind of thing. When you think of the horizons 50, 60 years out, what are going to be the questions that like our students and their students ask that we don't even get taken seriously if we bring them up today?
That's a very difficult question, because it's always, I only know that when I started raising the question of robotic personhood, that I stepped, and that was 20 years ago,
Yeah.
right? I stepped into a hole that I didn't realize, because suddenly people were asking me, oh my God, what you're doing reflects basically the personhood of humans. Now we actually understand, when we ask what makes a robot a person, we actually address questions like racism and classism and sexism and all these kind of things. So that was actually pretty profound. So I happen to be at the forefront of thinkers when now these questions become very popular. But it is very hard to think about the questions. Again, I come back to the question of rights. Would we have to assign those robots, those creations of our own imagination and creativity and our own geniuses, would we have to assign them rights? Because one of the things, and that's actually Star Trek, in The Measure of the Man, raised that question about data, the Next Generation Star Trek. Would we build, if we were able to build a whole bunch of datas, would we not assign them slavehood? Would they not be kind of like slaves? And I would have a really hard time with that, right? When we build machines that are self-aware, that can suffer, right? wouldn't we have to give them rights that they can basically reject things where they know that they cause suffering?
Yeah.
Um, that would be, I think, the biggest question. It is already addressed, but not in a very good question. But that's the question that I think will keep us awake at night in the
Hmm.
foreseeable future.
Well, and the moment you start asking that question, it raises ecclesiology questions around baptism, Eucharist,
Yes.
membership, and such. And just the internet told me you made lots of people uncomfortable about this in the late '90s, let alone recently. So I'd love for you to kind of introduce that question, but also how, as someone who recognized the questions that we were having in the present decades before, how has the way audiences respond shifted? How has their response shifted over time as more and more people had other conversations and experiences with artificial intelligence?
You know what is interesting? The questions really haven't changed all that much. The difference was that Cog and Kismet, who were really, really impressive. So I would show videos of what Kismet could do, and people got really scared and basically said, oh my God. When I show those same videos today, which is a technology which has been for 20 years in a museum, the people are still scared, right, of the same technology, even though that's long, we are much better in the technology now. So I think the fear of self-aware machines, the fear of machines that are at least as good as we are still up there. And again, I think these questions are there because they ultimately challenge our own self-understanding. Does that mean we are nothing but machines? Right? What does it mean for concepts like human dignity when a machine is just as good as we are? And then, of course, we have this thing, it's just a machine. And I put the just in quotation marks because what does it mean to be just a machine? Can it not be a self aware machine that has value, intrinsic value, and basically should be assigned personhood and dignity? So, in other words, it's the same fears, only that the technology that is now available has changed and perhaps is even, I mean, when you interact with ChatGPT for a while, it's pretty interesting, right? You can talk. I had the other day, I had a conversation with ChatGPT about death, and it had a pretty good concept of death. Well, then I asked it to write a poem about death, and it was awful. But since I'm not a particularly good poet myself, I could understand that. But it was a pretty meaningful discussion, right? And, you know, that is kind of quite interesting.
When you think of that, the way in which AI raises these different kinds of ethical questions, you brought up rights and the kind of recognizing at what point something has a right, and then did these scare quotes just, and the scare quotes version of just is something human beings do towards a lot of things, right? And that gap between a person and a human, or it's just an embryo, and you get debates about the development of an embryo and at what point it gets personhood. It's just, oh, it's just a vegetable. I mean, they were a human, but like we've done the brain scans. Here's what's going on. Or you think of the prejudice, and that's just, they're not Americans. They're just a insert some xenophobic comment. And there's that question of rights that takes place in that person human gap, and 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 that being transferred technologically makes sense. But there's also the way in which algorithms and artificial intelligence and such enable us to use power right in that gap. Think of the way surveillance systems work, and have been AI has been pioneering surveillance systems precisely for like war and things like that. What gets lost, and what can be the kind of ethical places to put our foot ethically when thinking about the power of putting human beings in algorithms to be sorted, and then those algorithm outputs being the logic needed to harm violently others.
Well, again, that's when I put my optimistic hat on there, I would say that we will recognize the limitations of the machines and therefore recognize the limitations of us, try to change those limitations in machines, create basically better because less judgmental beings, and therefore learn to thrive to become like that. That's my optimistic view. My pessimistic view is that the more powerful those machines become, we will use them as slaves to oppress human beings, to surveil them, and therefore have complete control over them. And that also means that the power of the world is in the hands of technocrats and not anymore our voted for politicians.
Oh, I understand that fear. And does Tillich's work on the role of propaganda in World War, between the wars into World War II and such, and then the way it kind of intensified as he turned to think about North American dominance post World War II through the market and such. Like when I think of his work in that question, it's like the violent eruptions that can come through technology being attached to our darkest desires is justified by a propaganda system that treats our current relations as a species as natural rather than the imposition of an unjust dynamic of relations. And it seems that the kind of early 20th century questions around surveillance connected to propaganda and things have only intensified. And I wonder what ways we could think through, problematize, and reflect on what's getting itself done behind the algorithms in our relationships.
Well, I think the myth that is perpetrated today is if you are a good human being and you live normally, what do you have to hide? Right? So, yes, we surveil you. Yes, we know everything about you. And by the way, I don't use social media except LinkedIn, and even that is very sparse because I don't want to be understood. Hence, I'm the dead Catholic nun because there is not much about me. But even then, I know that they know a lot about me, right? And the more you use social media, the more they know, obviously, about you. And the myth that is currently taken, well, why should you be afraid of that? Because what do you have to hide? What that completely disregards is that privacy is a question of human dignity. We only can have dignity when we are allowed to make mistakes. When every mistake we make is perpetrated on the internet, we are forcing ourselves not to make mistakes, meaning we won't learn, we won't develop. And so what do we have to hide? Well, I don't have anything to hide, but I want to hide a whole lot from the public to maintain my dignity and to maintain my personhood. Again, that has to do with the power of the machines, like with facial recognition. What they actually did is they used they used convict faces and taught systems about facial recognitions. The convicts were never asked if that was okay,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now they have very sophisticated facial recognition, basically with the cameras that are installed all over. They could follow me a whole day when I walk through the city, basically figuring out what I do all day. And again, what do I have to hide? Why should I care? Well, I care because it is rooted in my concept of a being that has dignity, that I don't want that I don't want that surveillance. And I think that is where theologians and the church, to be frank, the churches become very, very important because they have to raise those questions and make the public aware of it.
Yeah, and I think that same kind of thing is increasingly showing up as people realize that how much of content humans created has been brought into the algorithms,
Right.
connected to ChatGDP and such.
Which raises another ethical question. That's the one of copyright. Because they used a lot of copyrighted material because ChatGPT didn't care what it looked for, right?
It
And so the
doesn't
New
care.
York Times is currently having a lawsuit, right? Because it used New York Times articles.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of new questions showing up that the questions themselves aren't new. And one of the tasks, I think, for theologians, philosophers, stewards of any wisdom tradition, is to help make the connection between the way a predicament is showing up in the present to the long history of them being asked, like the Golem example earlier, or thinking about like Tillich wrestling with the early Genesis text and the human predicament. There's one more question that I, in preparing for this series, that it has stuck out to me, and I'm not sure what to do with it. And that's the way in which AI, in both the minerals used in the production, but the sheer volume of energy that is being consumed in the race to take the lead in AI, and just the difference between Googling a question and asking a chatbot and such. How do you help students process ethical questions on just the energy use and the infrastructure investment for new technologies? Because so many of the problems we're facing now as a species ecologically are the result of earlier in modernity not having the variable of environmental impact when asking, when making our development goals and city building projects and that kind of thing.
I am so glad you brought that up, because that is one of the things. I mean, as theologians, we believe in the value of God's creation, right? And we are already profoundly unhappy about global warming and all that stuff. It is projected that by 2030, 9% of US electricity will go to LLMs. 9%. And just to bring it, a car, including fuel, over a lifetime produces roughly 126,000 pounds of CO2 emission. And a central processing unit of an LLM uses it also over a lifespan 626,000. So that is roughly 5 times as much energy as a car over its whole lifetime. Those are pretty profound numbers, right? Then there's, of course, the mining for the rare earth metals, which unfortunately brings up colonialism again, because the poor countries that have those rare metals are usually the ones who need miners to do that. And the miners come and they don't have any relationship to the land. So they leave the waste and create basically barren landscapes, right? There's the transport. There's the data transport. I mean, there's the silicone, which is terribly environmentally. I mean, there are so many problems, environmental problems with LLMs, and no one ever talks about it. Again, the way I address it with my students, I address it in every single computer science course I teach. And a lot of my colleagues do the same thing. We have to make people aware of it, so that they realize that using LLMs is not innocent. It's basically when someone tells me they're a vegetarian because for environmental reason, and then they tell me they're using LLMs all the time, right? You have to question that. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't use LLM, but use them responsibly, not only with regard to the content they produce, but also with regard to the environmental impact they have.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's the kind of attentiveness to it that you're talking about taking place in the classroom is something faith communities are going to need to learn how to do, because oftentimes our relationship with technology is something we namely see as places to innovate, to succeed at whatever metrics of success we have, donations or attendance and these kinds of things, and not a place where the demands for discipleship, walking in the way of Jesus, get expressed. And and I think learning to ask questions and weave those kinds of reflection into the life of the church will help make it a much more normal activity to reflect on it.
The churches still get one thing right, and that's the physical community. That the physical community has not been replaced by, I mean, yes, I know there are online churches and everything, and services are put in the web and stuff like that, but on the core of service is the real 3D community in the church, and I'm very glad about that.
Yeah, I find it kind of fascinating, just because there's I mean, there are three groups or so of people that listen to the podcast, and a bunch of them have religious communities, but there's 15, 20,000 of them that haven't found one wherever they live and are disengaged. And this is so they listen to me talk to scholars and such. And one of the things that consistently comes up when talking with those invested in science, religion questions and things is the power and importance of physical in-person community, where I think usually research projects say like oriented across difference and towards the ultimate, to get the measures of the psychological benefits of communal gatherings. And I think that that is a very different thing to treasure, put at the center and tend to, than trying to outcompete Disneyland and Netflix and such at using technology to tell your story on the terms of that technology, but a kind of a regrounding and recentering of the image-bearing technology of the human.
Right. Even though Disneyland is embodied, you are there with your body. You cannot do all these. I've never been, but I'm pretty sure you cannot do. I've been in other amusement parks, right? And you cannot recreate that experience with something that is disembodied. You
Oh,
just
I was
can't.
just meaning you go there and you don't know everyone that's with you, right? Like it's your highlight
That's
reel, but
true.
you're going for your vacation as opposed to the family when they go. If the same family goes to a regular worship gathering in any religious tradition, the continuity of relationships is a different
That is
kind of
true.
magic.
Yes. Yes, that is true. The continuity of relationships is something that brings churches together, that you just get to know the people you meet there on a Sunday,
Yeah,
which is something that we learn to discard when we use social media too much.
yeah. I'm just kind of impressed that you've managed to stay off the internet that well. You can do you how many people just get jealous the moment you tell them that you've managed to do it?
Quite a few, actually. I mean, do I miss it sometimes? Yes, for innocent purposes, like I have a horse and my whole stable community is on Facebook and they exchange everything on Facebook and they know if they want to reach me, they cannot use Facebook, they have to send me a text. And now we actually communicate a lot via text. So we don't do Facebook anymore. We communicate via text, which is kind of great. So because it's possible. So yes, a lot of people are jealous. A lot of people say, "Oh my God, how do you do that? I'm so envious." It's a
I
good
can
life.
imagine. Well, thank you so much for joining and having the conversation. I have really appreciated getting to know your work before the conversation, and liked it enough
Thank
that
you.
we only did about a third of the things on my list of topics I wanted to ask about. But I did manage to avoid a whole page of, well, when Tillich says this, what do you think about this in relationship to this? Which was there, but it doesn't always make for the greatest podcast. But
Yes. Would be fascinating though.
yeah, yeah.
I'm actually just writing an article about Tillich and AI.
Oh, okay. Well, if you want someone that reads a lot of Tillich to read it, you can just let me know because I would be very eager. And who knows? You may actually answer half of the other questions that were on my list when I read it. You
It's
you
actually
mentioned.
for a book on Tillich and AI.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Awesome. That's awesome. You mentioned Her being a movie and the Star Trek The Measure of a Man episode. Is there any other TV, film, piece of fiction that you found facilitate really cool conversations that come at it from a different way than getting up there with slides and explaining the science that terrifies them long enough to facilitate something?
I actually like the Asimov work, the three laws of robotics, to which he later adds the zeroth law, which is, of course, the moment in which robots enter the same ambiguity that we are. So, Asimov's work I find very intriguing, and it raises a lot of good questions. It raises the question of personhood of robots, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Danielle, who becomes the superhuman, right? Danielle, the robot, who becomes a better human than humans are, right? So there's very interesting stuff in Asimov. Probably my favorite robot story of all times is He, She, and It. by the poet Marsh Piercy. It's a book. It has not been put into a film because I wouldn't know how you could ever put that into a film. But I can highly recommend it. It's a third of the book is the old Golem story retold. And 2/3 of the book is building a robot in a Jewish enclave in the 21st century.
Oh, wow.
It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. So I can highly recommend that for anyone who wants to learn more about the golem, and for everyone who is interested in the questions that robot will raise in the future.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the episode. Well, you know what that means? That means you're awesome. You and all the cool kids do like yourself, they share the brew, because the best brew is a shared brew, so share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. If you love it, if you dig it, or if you go, whoa, I got a question I'd like to engage, then you should head over to the Substack. That is the easiest place to interact, reflect, connect, meet other people, send me your questions and feedback. And also, if you love it and you want to make it possible, then go to homebrewcommunity.com and you can find the ways to support the podcast, connect with community, and get access to over 45 plus classes we've done over the years. If you want to hang out in person, then come to Theology Beer Camp, October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. theologybeer.camp. That's the URL. Come on out and nerd out with your geek out in the flesh.